Well, joining me right now, I'm delighted to say, is Lord Dannatt. Richard Dannatt is the former head of the British Army, former Chief of the Defence Staff. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Lord Dannatt. Do you agree with Penny Mordaunt in criticising the Chancellor on the lack of increase in funding for defences?
Well, I think Penny has put her finger on what a number of us have put our fingers on for quite some time. That is that the provision for defence in this country, for the sake of this own country and also for our membership for NATO and our collective security of Europe, frankly, is woefully underfunded. We're spending just about 2.3% of GDP on defence, and that's inflated by putting things like military pensions into the equation.
Which are very important, but don't actually contribute to our ability to defend our nation.
Well, indeed. The key point is that we're giving a lot of support to Ukraine at the present moment, and that's absolutely right and proper. But Ukraine effectively is fighting for the security of Europe and, by extension, the security of the United Kingdom. But we can't rely on Ukraine or our other allies indefinitely. There's a very strong case to say that our defence expenditure should go up significantly to 3 or 4% of GDP, and that's putting it up from £50 billion a year to around £70 to £75 billion a year. I know that's a big ask for the Chancellor, but frankly, the first duty of government, as Penny Mordaunt has pointed out, is to the security of our country and our people.
Yeah, and this is the thing, when people talk about the huge cost and indeed the help for the aid for Ukraine of a lot of our military aid, these are actually much smaller prices to pay than the failure to do that. This is sort of the equivalent of, having insurance for when, the rain starts coming through your roof, doing the small repairs early rather than waiting for the whole thing to collapse. A lot of people are saying, oh, we can't afford this, not our war, not our problem over there. We've already seen when Russia invades Ukraine, massive hit to our economy from energy prices and the impact on the rest of the world in terms of the food and the fertiliser and the things that they provide to many other countries, but also the massive impact on Europe and on our security. A lot of the public, general public audience here perhaps may not have woken up to a lot of this, but are you worried by how few politicians seem to get this?
Well, I think you've summed up the problem extremely well. I think the difficulty is that our politicians aren't prepared to speak up sufficiently on behalf of defence. I think they made the judgment in a general election year that there aren't any or many votes in defence. Rather better for them to focus on NHS waiting lists, health and social security and those sort of things. But the fact of the matter is, and the analogy that you made with household insurance is absolutely right, the cost of fighting a war would be disastrous. But the price of deterring a war is an important one to pay. And just let me quote 3 figures at you. In 1935, we spent less than 3% of GDP on defence. But when the war had broken out and we'd failed to deter Hitler, it went up to 18%. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our lives, it was 46%. That's the disastrous cost of fighting a war. Big question is, should we not be paying a bit more to deter war by increasing what we pay for our premium?
Absolutely, and we know the Russian war economy right now is fully into action. I think I read this week something like a third of government spending is now going on the war effort. Now that has a massive hit for ordinary Russians back home who've no part of this, but it just shows what we are up against when we're all sitting here going, oh, I'm not sure we've got enough fighter jets to give, or I'm not sure we've got enough ammunition to give. The West is lagging way behind in terms of the aid we are giving to Ukraine even right now.
Julia, you're absolutely right. And of course, the other thing about the Russian war economy, yes, about a third of their expenditures going on defence, but their ammunition factories and defence factories are working 24/7, 3 shifts a day to produce what they need. Now, our own industrial base is extremely thin. Are the ammunition factories in this country working 24/7, 3 shifts a day? And indeed, is our industrial defence base broad enough? I'm afraid the answer is no. If we want to take defence seriously, there's an industrial aspect to this, as well as a military capability aspect to this, and it's all underpinned by finance. Is the Chancellor going to put more money in the budget?
Yeah,
Let's wait and see.
It's money that talks, and as you say, in an election year, it's not a vote winner, he will argue. What did you make of what Emmanuel Macron had to say following the European Security Conference at the weekend, where he talked about the possibility of there being NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine? He said there was no consensus. This was immediately shot down by US, British, German, Polish and other leaders. But as he pointed out afterwards, well, yeah, a lot of people changed their tune on a lot of things, I'm paraphrasing. My French isn't that good. But he was saying, no, a lot of people have said no tanks, no jets, and they changed their tune. Do you think we will eventually see, whether it's not a NATO-organised sending of troops, but one of our NATO allies sending troops to fight in Ukraine?
It's really important the distinction is drawn between us supporting Ukraine and us putting British, French, American, German boots on the ground in Ukraine fighting the Russians. That would, at a stroke, make this a war between NATO and Russia, which is exactly what Putin has been saying to his people. He's been telling them that NATO is the aggressor and that NATO is attacking Mother Russia. We frankly just mustn't do that. Of course, we must go on supplying Ukraine with training, with equipment, with ammunition, with all forms of support. But putting Western boots on the ground or even pilots in the air policing a no-fly zone would be tantamount to admitting to Putin that, yes, NATO is at war with Russia, and we're not. We are merely supporting Ukraine control its own sovereign territory, as indeed we will support other countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, other NATO countries that border Russia, to make sure that Russian aggression is deterred and that their sovereign territory is maintained under their own control.
OK. Can I also ask you about more domestic affairs in this country? Because you're talking about, agreeing with Penny Mordaunt, our first duty is to protect Britain and the need for defence spending. But a lot of people also say, that, actually law and order on the streets. I think the second duty of a government. The Prime Minister yesterday told police chiefs that he was warning of a growing consensus that mob rule is replacing democratic rule. And he said we must change that urgently. A lot of people always seem to say, like, if in doubt, bring in the army. The army with the solution throughout 2020, 2021, whatever the issue, economic crisis, NHS crisis, bring in the army because they get things done, which has certainly been very clear to all of us. What is the solution? How do we deal with this? And do you agree that we've got mob rule on our streets?
Well, we certainly don't bring in the army. We have not since Peterloo in 1819 have the military been used in securing civil order. This is very much a matter for the police. Now, Parliament in recent times has passed a lot more strengthening legislation. And I think what the Prime Minister not unreasonably is saying to senior police chiefs and police and crime commissioners around the country is, you've got the laws. Now, please enforce the laws to make sure that protesting and demonstrating, which is a civil liberty and part of our democracy, is done in a sensible and safe way. So I think there's a challenge here for senior police officers to make sure they allocate the right resources. There's also a challenge for the organiser of marches to make sure that they're kept in good order so that they can make their point. It's a fundamental part of democracy. We need to be very careful to the extent to which we interfere with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army, former Chief of the Defence Staff.